Chapter 1. The Seeds of Change. France in the late 1700s was a land of beauty. The countryside was green and peaceful. The cities were full of life and laughter. But beneath this beauty, there was great suffering. Rich nobles lived in grand palaces. They wore silk clothes and ate feasts of fine food. They danced at balls, sang songs, and laughed late into the night. The peasants, however, lived a very different life. Their homes were small and cold. Many families shared one room. They worked hard in the fields, but their harvests were not enough. There was little bread to eat. When the harvest was bad, people went hungry. Children cried in their mother's arms. Fathers grew thin and weak. The people of France were suffering. The nobles didn't notice, or perhaps they didn't care. They kept spending money on parties and clothes. The king, Louis XVI, ruled over everyone. He lived in the Palace of Versailles. It was like a dream. A golden palace full of art, music, and gardens. Queen Marie Antoinette loved to spend money too. She bought dresses, jewels, and wigs. She hosted expensive parties. The people saw this and became angry. "They have everything," the peasants said, "and we have nothing." But it wasn't just the peasants who were angry. Shopkeepers, workers, and even some educated men were unhappy. France was in trouble. The country owed a lot of money. Taxes were high, and the king kept borrowing more. The rich nobles didn't pay taxes. Only the poor paid, and they had nothing left to give. People began to talk. Quietly at first, in dark corners of taverns, in whispers on the streets, but the whispers grew louder. "This isn't fair," they said. "Why do the rich have so much? Why do the poor suffer?" Some spoke of change, others spoke of revolution. The air felt different. Tense, as if a storm was coming. One cold winter, bread became too expensive. People could not buy enough to eat. Crowds gathered in the streets of Paris. Women with tired faces held their children close. "We are hungry," they cried. "Feed us." Their voices were full of anger and fear. The king stayed in his palace. He did not listen. But the people's anger grew. They blamed the king and queen. They blamed the nobles. They blamed the system that kept them poor. Each day, more people began to speak out. Writers and thinkers shared new ideas. They spoke of liberty, freedom for all people. They spoke of equality, an end to unfairness, and they spoke of fraternity, brotherhood, and unity. These ideas were powerful. They gave people hope. One day, a young man named Jacques stood in the marketplace. He clenched his fists as he looked at the rich man in a fancy coat riding past in a carriage. Jacques' family worked hard every day. They barely had enough bread. Yet, this man lived in comfort and ease. "It isn't right," Jacques muttered. His friends nodded. They felt the same. In a small room that evening, Jacques and his friends talked. "We need to do something," one said. We can't live like this anymore." Jacques agreed. His heart pounded. He felt scared, but also excited. Around France, people like Jacques were having the same conversations. Soon, there were protests in the streets. People gathered in crowds, shouting and waving signs. They demanded bread. They demanded justice. Sometimes, the protests turned violent. Windows were smashed. Shops were looted. The tension grew. Then, something happened that no one could ignore. In a small village, a group of peasants refused to pay taxes. They said they had nothing left to give. The king's soldiers arrived to punish them, but the peasants fought back. They used tools, sticks, and even rocks. The soldiers were shocked. This had never happened before. News of the fight spread quickly. People whispered about it in the cities and villages. "If they can fight back," they said, "why can't we?" The whispers of rebellion turned into shouts, and the shouts grew louder each day. People began to dream of a new France, a fair France, a free France. But change would not come easily. The king would not give up his power without a fight, and the nobles would not let go of their wealth. The people knew they faced danger, yet their anger was stronger than their fear. In the spring of 1789, the king called a meeting. It was called the Estates General. He hoped it would calm the people. Representatives from all over France came to discuss the future. There were three groups: the nobles, the clergy, and the common people. But the common people were tired of being ignored. When the meeting began, they demanded change. "We will not be silent," they said. The king grew nervous. He ordered the meeting to stop, but the common people refused to leave. They gathered in a tennis court and made a promise. They would not stop fighting until France had a fair constitution. It was the beginning of something new. Outside, the streets of Paris were alive with energy. People marched with torches. They shouted slogans and sang songs. They believed change was coming. But change would not come without a cost. Chapter 2. A King in Trouble. King Louis XVI sat in his grand palace. The walls were covered with gold. Outside, the gardens stretched for miles. Everything was perfect, or so it seemed. Louis was not happy. He felt the weight of the crown. He wanted to be a good king, but it was hard. The problems of France were too big for him. The country was running out of money. The people were starving. Everywhere there was talk of anger and change. But Louis didn't know what to do. His advisors gave him advice, but it was always different. "Raise taxes," one said. "The people can pay more." But another said, "Cut spending. Stop wasting money." Louis listened, but he could not decide. He sighed. His ancestors had been strong kings. They had ruled with power and confidence. But Louis was different. He was unsure. Meanwhile, Queen Marie Antoinette was busy. She loved parties, music, and fashion. She wore beautiful dresses and tall wigs. People said she sparkled like the sun. But the queen also had enemies. The people of France called her Madame Deficit. They blamed her for the country's problems. They said she spent too much money. They said she didn't care about them. One cold day, a crowd gathered outside the palace gates. They were hungry. Many held signs. "We need bread," they shouted. "Feed us!" Marie Antoinette heard the noise. She looked out from her window. "Why are they shouting?" she asked. Her ladies-in-waiting said nothing. It was said that the Queen once told the people, "Let them eat cake." But this is not true. She never said those words. Still, it became a symbol of her. To the people, the Queen was out of touch. Inside the palace, the king felt trapped. He wanted to help, but he did not know how. He tried to listen to the people. He called for a meeting of the Estates General. It was the first time in 175 years. The Estates General brought together 3 groups of people. The first group was the clergy, or church leaders. They were rich and powerful. The second group was the nobles. They lived in grand houses and paid no taxes. The third group was the common people. They were shopkeepers, workers, and farmers. The meeting began. The king hoped it would calm the anger, but it only made things worse. The common people spoke loudly. "We are tired of being ignored," they said. "We are tired of being hungry." They wanted change, but the nobles and the clergy did not listen. The king became nervous. He ordered the meeting to stop. The common people were furious. "We will not be silenced," they shouted. They left the room and gathered in a tennis court. There, they made a vow. They promised to fight for a new France. The king's troubles grew. Each day, the streets of Paris became louder. The people's anger burned like fire. One night, Louis sat at his desk. He held a letter in his hand. It was from one of his advisors. The words were clear. "The people are planning something. They are preparing to rise." The king's hands shook. He felt fear, but he also felt anger. "I am the king," he said softly. "They should obey me." But deep down, Louis knew the truth. His power was slipping away. In the palace gardens, Marie Antoinette walked with her children. She smiled as they played. For a moment, she felt happy. But then she heard shouts. She turned her head. A group of peasants had gathered near the gates. They waved torches and banners. Their voices filled the air. "Down with the Queen!" they cried. Marie Antoinette's smile faded. She held her children close. That night, she wrote a letter to her family in Austria. "France is dangerous," she wrote. "The people hate me. I fear for my life." Back in Paris, the mood was electric. The people wanted change, and they wanted it now. They gathered in cafes and taverns. They read pamphlets and talked about liberty. The king tried to calm the storm. He made promises. He said he would fix the problems, but the people didn't believe him. A man named Robespierre spoke to a crowd one evening. His voice was clear and sharp. "The king is weak," he said. "He cannot save us. We must save ourselves." The crowd cheered. The king heard about Robespierre. He felt a chill. This man was dangerous. As the weeks passed, the king grew more isolated. He stayed inside the palace, far from the people. He signed papers and held meetings, but nothing seemed to help. One evening, he spoke to Marie Antoinette. "What should I do?" he asked. The queen shook her head. "We must stand strong," she said. "We are the rulers of France." But Louis did not feel strong. He felt afraid. The pressure on the king grew heavier. The people wanted him to act. They wanted him to listen. But Louis hesitated. He was caught between two worlds, the old world of kings and queens, and the new world the people dreamed of. On a warm summer night, Louis looked out from his balcony. He saw the lights of Paris in the distance. The city was alive with energy, but it was not the energy of joy. It was the energy of revolution. The king turned away from the window. He felt tired. The weight of his crown pressed down on him. Chapter 3. Storming the Bastille. The sun rose early on July 14th, 1789. It was a hot summer day. The streets of Paris were restless. People whispered to each other as they gathered in the squares and markets. Something big was about to happen. Paris was full of anger. Bread was scarce. Taxes were high. The king had sent soldiers to the city. The people felt trapped. They were tired of waiting. They wanted action. A man named Pierre stood among the crowd. He was a carpenter, strong and young. His hands were rough from work, but his heart was full of fire. "We cannot live like this anymore," he said to his friends. "We must fight." The crowd grew larger. Hundreds of people filled the streets. They carried makeshift weapons, sticks, knives, even farming tools. Some held torches. Others held banners that read, "Liberty, Equality." "The Bastille!" someone shouted. The Bastille was a large stone prison. It was old and dark. For the people of Paris, it was a symbol of the king's power. Inside, there were prisoners, guards, and weapons. The people wanted the weapons. But more than that, they wanted to show the king they were not afraid. The crowd marched toward the Bastille. Their voices grew louder. "Down with the king!" they cried. "We want freedom!" Pierre's heart pounded. He had never seen so many people united. He clenched his fists. "This is the start of something new," he thought. The Bastille's gates were tall and heavy. Guards stood at the top of the walls, looking down at the crowd. The leader of the Bastille, Governor de Launay, was inside. He watched nervously. The shouts from the crowd grew louder. "They are too many," one guard said. "What should we do?" "Hold your ground," Delaunay ordered, but his voice shook. The people reached the gates. They banged on the doors with sticks and tools. "Open the gates!" they shouted. "Give us the weapons!" But the gates stayed closed. The crowd grew angrier. Pierre looked up at the guards. His eyes burned with determination. "They won't listen to us," he said. "We must act." Someone fired a shot. No one knew who fired first. The sound echoed through the streets. For a moment, there was silence. Then chaos erupted. The guards fired back at the crowd. People screamed and ran for cover, but the crowd did not stop. They pushed forward, throwing rocks and bottles. Pierre grabbed a torch and ran toward the gates. His heart raced. "We can do this!" he shouted. More people joined the fight. Workers, shopkeepers, even women and children. They brought ladders to climb the walls. They used ropes to pull down the gates. The noise was deafening. Inside the Bastille, the guards fought back, but they were outnumbered. The people kept coming. Their anger was stronger than their fear. Finally, the gates began to crack. The crowd cheered. Pierre felt a surge of hope. "We're going to win," he thought. After hours of fighting, the gates fell. The crowd rushed inside. The guards dropped their weapons and surrendered. Governor Delaunay was captured. The people had taken the Bastille. Pierre stood in the courtyard, breathing heavily. The air was filled with smoke and cheers. He looked around at the faces of the crowd. Some were crying. Others were laughing. "This is the beginning," Pierre whispered. The prisoners inside the Bastille were freed. There were only a few, but their release was a powerful symbol. The people had won. They carried Governor Delaunay through the streets. Some wanted to spare his life. Others wanted revenge. In the end, anger won. Delaunay was executed. The crowd took pieces of the Bastille, stones, wood, and chains. They carried them home as souvenirs. The Bastille, once a symbol of fear, was now a symbol of freedom. News of the Bastille's fall spread quickly. In the countryside, peasants heard the story and felt brave. They began to rise up against their landlords. Across France, the old system of power started to crumble. In Versailles, King Louis XVI heard the news. He looked at his advisor with wide eyes. "Is it a revolt?" he asked. "No, sire," the advisor replied. "It is a revolution." The king said nothing. He turned away and stared out the window. The world he knew was falling apart. For Pierre and the people of Paris, July 14th, 1789, was more than just a day. It was a turning point. The Bastille's fall showed that the people had power. They could stand up to the king. But it was also the start of something dangerous. The fight for freedom would not be easy. More battles were coming. More sacrifices would be made. Pierre stood in the streets that night. The city was quiet now, but the air felt different. It was heavy with possibility. He thought about his family, his friends, and the future. "France is changing," he said softly. "And I will be part of it." Chapter 4. Liberty, Equality, Fraternity. The streets of Paris were alive with energy. People talked, argued, and shouted in the squares. They spoke of liberty, equality, and fraternity, freedom, fairness, and brotherhood. These were big ideas. They gave people hope. But dreams are not easy to achieve. Pierre stood with a group of friends near a cafe. They had just heard a speech from a revolutionary leader. The man had a strong voice and fiery words. "We must fight for a new France," he had shouted. The crowd cheered, their fists in the air. Now, Pierre felt both excited and nervous. "Do you think we can really change things?" he asked. His friend Marie nodded. She was young, with bright eyes full of determination. "We have to," she said. "If we don't, who will?" The revolution had begun. The National Assembly was writing new laws. They wanted to end the old ways of the monarchy. No more kings with absolute power, no more nobles with special privileges. The people of Paris were proud. They had taken the Bastille. They had shown their strength. But the work was far from over. In the assembly, men debated fiercely. Some wanted slow changes. Others wanted to rebuild France completely. Arguments lasted for hours. Sometimes voices were raised. But outside the assembly, life was still hard. Bread was expensive. Taxes were high. The people wanted action, and they wanted it now. One afternoon, Pierre and Marie walked through the market. They saw a group of women talking loudly. One of them, an older woman, waved a loaf of bread in the air. "This cost my entire week's pay," she cried. The women grew angrier. "We are starving," they said. "We fought for freedom. But what has changed?" Pierre felt a knot in his stomach. He had seen this anger before. He remembered the storming of the Bastille. That same fire burned in these women's eyes. At night, Paris was restless. The sound of marching feet filled the streets. Groups of citizens, armed with sticks and old swords, patrolled the city. They called themselves the National Guard. Their leader, Lafayette, was a hero from the American Revolution. He believed in liberty, but he also believed in order. "We must protect the revolution," he told his men, "but we must also protect the people." The National Guard tried to keep peace, but sometimes peace was hard to find. Fights broke out in the streets. Tensions were high. In the middle of it all, the king stayed in Versailles. He still lived in luxury. He still wore fine clothes and ate grand meals, but his power was fading. One evening, the king received news from the National Assembly. They had written the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It said all men were born free and equal. It said everyone had the right to liberty, property, and security. The king frowned as he read it. "What does this mean for me?" he asked his advisors. But deep down, Louis already knew the answer. The people of Paris celebrated the declaration. They gathered in the streets to read it aloud. Pierre stood among them, listening. The words filled him with hope. Marie smiled as she held a copy of the declaration. "This is what we've been fighting for," she said. "This is the start of a new France." Pierre nodded, but he noticed something in the crowd. Some faces were still angry. Some voices whispered, "It's not enough." Days turned into weeks. The excitement of the revolution mixed with fear. People didn't trust each other. Rumors spread quickly. "The king is planning to attack us," some said. The nobles want to bring back the old ways. In the assembly, tempers flared. Some members wanted to work with the king. Others wanted to get rid of him completely. Robespierre, a young and passionate speaker, became a rising star. "We cannot trust the king," he said. "The people must take control." His words were powerful. Some cheered, others feared him. One rainy morning, Pierre and Marie joined a march. Hundreds of women, carrying pots, pans, and even pitchforks, were heading to Versailles. They wanted to speak to the king. "We want bread!" they shouted. "We want justice!" The march was long and cold, but the women were strong. Pierre and Marie walked beside them, silent but determined. When they reached Versailles, the women stood outside the palace gates. They demanded to see the king. Their voices echoed through the courtyard. Finally, the gates opened. The king appeared on the balcony. He looked tired and pale. The leader of the march stepped forward. She held up an empty basket. "Do you see this?" she called. "This is what we have. Nothing." The king nodded slowly. He promised to help, but the crowd was not satisfied. That night, the king made a decision. He would leave Versailles and move to Paris. He hoped it would calm the people. When the king arrived in Paris, the streets were packed. Some cheered, others stared silently. Marie looked at the king's face. "He looks so unsure," she whispered. Pierre frowned. "Because he is," he said. "Liberty, equality, fraternity." The words were everywhere, written on banners, painted on walls, shouted in the streets. But Pierre knew the revolution was far from over. The ideas were powerful, but making them real would take time and sacrifice. He looked at Marie. "Do you think we'll ever have true liberty?" he asked. Marie's eyes were bright. "Yes," she said, "but we have to keep fighting for it." Pierre nodded. He felt hope, but he also felt fear. Chapter 5. The King on Trial. The streets of Paris were cold and gray. Winter had come, but the city buzzed with energy. People whispered in markets and squares. Big news had spread. The king was to stand trial. Pierre heard the news while walking home. He stopped in his tracks. "The king on trial," he said to himself. It sounded impossible. Kings were supposed to be untouchable. They ruled by divine right. They were chosen by God. But now, Louis XVI was just a man. The National Assembly had taken away his power. The revolutionaries no longer trusted him. They believed he was working against them. Some even said he was helping France's enemies. Inside his prison, King Louis XVI sat quietly. The room was bare, cold, and silent. It was far from the golden halls of Versailles. He looked at a letter from his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. She wrote of her love for him and her worries for their children. Louis felt a pang of sadness. His family was in danger, and he could not protect them. He thought of the people outside. Once, They had cheered for him as their king. Now they called him a traitor. Louis sighed. He had always tried to be a good king, but it had not been enough. The trial began in a large hall. It was crowded with revolutionaries, guards, and citizens. Pierre stood at the back of the room, his heart pounding. He had come to see history being made. The prosecutors listed the charges against the king. They said he had betrayed his country. They said he had plotted with foreign powers to stop the revolution. Louis sat calmly. He listened to the accusations without showing emotion. But his hands trembled in his lap. When it was his turn to speak, the king stood. His voice was steady but quiet. "I have always loved France," he said. "I never meant to harm my people. I am innocent of these charges." Some in the crowd murmured, "Was the king telling the truth?" The trial lasted for days. Witnesses spoke for and against the king. Some defended him, saying he was a kind and gentle man. Others said he was weak and selfish. Outside, the people waited. They stood in the cold, hoping to hear the verdict. The city was tense. Marie paced in her small room. She held her children close, trying to comfort them. But she could not hide her fear. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The hall was silent as the president of the assembly stood to speak. Pierre held his breath. The National Assembly finds Louis Capet guilty of treason, the president said. There was a gasp in the room. Some people cheered. Others looked shocked. The president continued, "The punishment is death." Pierre felt his knees go weak. The king was to die. When Louis heard the verdict, he closed his eyes. He felt a wave of sadness, but also relief. The waiting was over. He asked for two things: to say goodbye to his family and to write a letter. The guards agreed. That evening, Louis hugged his wife and children tightly. Tears rolled down their faces. "Be strong," he told them. "Remember that I love you." The next morning, Louis wrote a letter to the people of France. He asked for forgiveness. He said he hoped the revolution would bring peace. On January 21st, 1793, the king was led to the scaffold. A large crowd gathered to watch. The guillotine stood tall, its blade gleaming in the winter sun. Pierre stood near the front of the crowd. He felt sick. He had fought for the revolution, but this moment felt heavy. Louis climbed the steps to the platform. He looked calm, even as his hands were tied. Before the executioner could act, Louis turned to the crowd. "I die innocent," he said loudly. "I forgive those who condemn me." The executioner signaled to the guards. The drum roll began. The blade fell quickly. The crowd gasped. Some people cheered, shouting, "Long live the Republic!" Others wept silently. Pierre turned away. His hands were shaking. He had dreamed of freedom and equality, but now he felt only sorrow. The death of the king was a turning point. France was no longer a monarchy. It was a republic ruled by the people. But the revolution was far from over. New challenges lay ahead. The people of France had won their freedom, but they were about to learn how difficult it was to keep it. Pierre walked home in silence. His thoughts were heavy. "Is this what we wanted?" he asked himself. Marie greeted him at the door. She looked into his eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. Pierre didn't know the answer. Before we begin Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6: The Guillotine and the Queen. The air in Paris was cold and heavy. A few months had passed since King Louis XVII's execution. The people were still angry. They wanted more. Their eyes turned to the Queen. Marie Antoinette sat alone in her small prison cell. The room was dark and damp. The grand dresses, jewels, and parties of Versailles were only a memory now. She wore a simple black dress. Her once tall wigs were gone. Her hair was cut short and gray. She thought of her children. They had been taken from her. She didn't know if they were safe. She thought of her husband, Louis, and the day he died. A tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. The guards came for her early one morning. "It's time," one said. His voice was cold. Marie Antoinette nodded. She stood up straight. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. The Queen was taken to the courthouse. It was loud and crowded. People filled the seats, eager to see her trial. Many of them cheered as she entered the room. Marie Antoinette looked at the faces in the crowd. They were full of anger and hate. But she didn't look away. She kept her head high. The charges were read aloud. They accused her of spending too much money, of betraying France, and of plotting against the revolution. Some accusations were lies. One was so cruel that Marie Antoinette finally spoke. Her voice was steady, but filled with pain. "I appeal to all mothers," she said. "What you accuse me of is false and inhuman." The crowd grew quiet for a moment, but the silence didn't last. The trial lasted for 2 days. Witnesses came forward to speak against her. They called her greedy. They called her cruel. Marie Antoinette said little. She knew her fate was already decided. When the verdict was announced, there was no surprise. "Guilty," the judge declared. "The punishment is death." The crowd cheered. For them, the Queen was a symbol of everything wrong with the old monarchy. They wanted her gone. That night, Marie Antoinette, was taken back to her cell. She sat on the small wooden bed and wrote a letter to her sister. Her hands trembled as she held the pen. "I am calm," she wrote. "I forgive my enemies. I pray for my children." She folded the letter carefully. A guard came to take it away. The morning of October 16th, 1793, was gray and quiet. The Queen was dressed in a simple white gown. Her hands were tied behind her back. A cart waited outside to take her to the scaffold. The streets of Paris were crowded. People lined the roads, shouting and jeering. Some threw rotten food. Others stood silently, watching. In the cart, Marie Antoinette kept her head high. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't cry. She stared straight ahead. The cart reached the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine stood tall in the center. Its blade gleamed in the pale light. Marie Antoinette climbed the steps to the platform. Her steps were steady. She didn't falter. The executioner stepped forward to tie her feet. As he did, she accidentally stepped on his foot. "Pardon me," she said softly. "I didn't mean to do it." These were her last words. The crowd grew silent as the Queen was placed under the blade. The drum roll began. The blade fell swiftly. It was over. The people cheered loudly. The monarchy was gone. First the king, now the Queen. But as the cheers faded, a strange feeling filled the air. Some felt relief. Others felt sadness. Pierre was in the crowd that day. He had seen the king die. Now he watched the Queen's death. He thought of the word liberty. Is this what liberty looks like? He wondered. Marie Antoinette's death marked the end of an era. But the revolution was far from over. Back in the streets of Paris, the people began to talk. Some said, "We have won." Others said, "The real fight is just beginning." The National Assembly was divided. Some leaders wanted to keep pushing for change. Others wanted to slow down. One man stood out among them. His name was Robespierre. He believed the revolution needed to continue, but his vision was strict and unforgiving. Enemies of the revolution must be punished, he declared. The guillotine became a symbol of fear. It had been used to end the monarchy. Now it was used to silence anyone who opposed the revolution. Pierre saw the changes in Paris. The excitement of liberty had turned into suspicion. People accused their neighbors of being traitors. Friends turned against friends. Marie joined Pierre at the market one day. She looked worried. "Do you think this will ever end?" she asked. Pierre didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Marie Antoinette's life had been full of luxury. Her end was full of pain. She had been a queen, a wife, and a mother. Now she was a memory. But her death raised a question. How far should the revolution go? The streets of Paris were still restless. The dream of liberty, equality, and fraternity was alive. but the cost of that dream was growing higher every day. Chapter 7. The Reign of Terror. The year was 1793. Paris was tense. The revolution had brought hope, but now it brought fear. Robespierre was one of the leaders of the revolution. He believed in liberty, equality, and fraternity. But he also believed in justice, harsh justice. Robespierre wanted to protect the new France. He saw danger everywhere. Enemies of the revolution are hiding among us, he said. We must stop them. He was serious. Too serious. The guillotine stood in the center of Paris. Its blade was sharp and ready. At first, it had been used for kings and nobles. Now, it was used for anyone who was seen as an enemy. Every day, crowds gathered to watch. The square was full of noise, shouts, cheers, and whispers. People came to see who would be next. Pierre stood in the crowd one morning. He had come to see a trial. A man named Jacques, a baker, was accused of speaking against the revolution. Jacques stood before the judges. His face was pale. I only said the bread prices were unfair, he explained. I didn't mean to insult the revolution. The judges didn't listen. The verdict was quick. Guilty. Pierre's heart sank. Jacques had always been kind. This isn't justice, Pierre thought. Fear spread like a shadow across France. People didn't trust each other. A neighbor's whisper could send you to the guillotine. Friends became enemies. Marie looked worried as she sat with Pierre in the market. Do you hear the rumors? She asked softly. What rumors? Pierre replied. They say even the revolution's leaders are turning against each other. No one is safe. Pierre nodded. He had heard the same whispers. Even Robespierre's friends were in danger. Robespierre gave passionate speeches in the National Assembly. His words were powerful. We must protect the revolution at all costs, he declared. Without order, there can be no freedom. Some people agreed with him. They believed strong actions were needed. But others grew afraid of Robespierre. They began to wonder if he cared more about power than liberty. One evening, Pierre walked through the streets of Paris. The air was cold and heavy. He passed the square where the guillotine stood. It was quiet now, but the sight of it made him shiver. He thought about Jacques, the baker. He thought about all the others who had lost their lives. Is this what we fought for? Pierre asked himself. He remembered the dreams of liberty and equality. They had felt so bright and full of hope. Now, those dreams felt far away. The reign of terror grew worse. Nobles, priests, workers, and even revolutionaries were executed. No one was safe. One day, Pierre heard shocking news. Danton, a close ally of Robespierre, had been arrested. Danton was a hero of the revolution, but now he was accused of being an enemy. The trial was quick. The verdict was harsh. Danton was sent to the guillotine. Marie's face was pale when she heard the news. "If Danton can fall, anyone can," she said. Pierre didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Robespierre's power grew stronger, but his list of enemies grew longer. People began to fear him. Even his closest allies started to turn against him. In July 1794, the National Assembly decided they had had enough. Robespierre was arrested. Pierre was in the crowd when Robespierre was taken to the guillotine. The man who had sent so many others to their deaths now faced the same fate. The crowd was silent as the blade fell. The reign of terror ended with Robespierre's death, but the scars it left behind were deep. Pierre stood in the square that evening. The guillotine was gone, but its shadow still hung over the city. He thought of all the lives lost. He thought of liberty and equality. Was it worth it? He wondered. Marie joined him. She touched his arm gently. "We have to believe in the future," she said. Pierre nodded slowly. He wanted to believe, but the cost of the revolution had been so high. France began to rebuild. The dreams of liberty, equality, and fraternity were still alive. But the people knew those dreams would take time to achieve. Pierre walked home that night, deep in thought. He remembered the early days of the revolution. He remembered the hope, the excitement, and the fire. The fire was still there, but now it burned differently. It was quieter, more determined. Chapter 8: A Nation Transformed. The revolution had shaken France. The old ways were gone. Kings, nobles, and priests no longer held the same power. New ideas filled the air. Pierre stood in the square one morning. He looked at a poster on the wall. It announced the end of feudal rights. No more would peasants be forced to work for free. No more would lords control their land. Pierre smiled. "This is what we fought for," he thought. But not everyone was smiling. In some villages, nobles refused to give up their privileges. Angry crowds gathered. Fires burned in the countryside. The revolution had brought change, but it had also brought chaos. The National Assembly worked hard to create new laws. They wrote a constitution for France. It promised liberty and equality for all citizens. Marie held a copy of the Constitution in her hands. She read it slowly. "Look, Pierre," she said, pointing to the words. "It says everyone has the right to own property. Everyone is equal under the law." Pierre nodded. He felt proud. The dreams of the revolution were becoming real. But not all changes were welcome. The church had lost much of its power. Priests were no longer trusted. Many churches were closed or turned into public buildings. In one village, the people tore down a statue of a saint. They replaced it with a statue of liberty. Some cheered. Others wept. Pierre's mother shook her head when she heard the news. "The church has been part of our lives for so long," she said. "How can we live without it?" Pierre didn't know what to say. He respected his mother's feelings, but he also believed in the revolution. The streets of Paris were alive with energy. Markets bustled with activity. People gathered in cafes to debate and discuss. New ideas spread quickly. One idea was especially powerful: merit. It meant that people should earn their positions through talent and hard work, not by birth. For centuries, only nobles had held important jobs. Now, anyone could rise to power. Pierre's neighbor, Jacques, had become a teacher. "I never thought I'd have this chance," Jacques said one day. "The revolution changed everything." Pierre smiled. "You earned it," he said. But the streets of Paris were also dangerous. Trust was hard to find. People whispered about spies and traitors. One evening, Pierre saw two men arguing in an alley. One accused the other of working for France's enemies. The argument grew louder. Suddenly, a fight broke out. Pierre stepped back, his heart racing. The revolution had ended many injustices, but it had also created fear. The National Assembly introduced new symbols for the nation. The tricolor flag, blue, white, and red, was now the symbol of France. The song La Marseillaise became the anthem. At a festival in the square, Pierre joined a crowd singing the anthem. Their voices were strong and full of hope. For a moment, it felt like the revolution had brought unity. Marie stood beside him. "Do you think we'll have peace now?" she asked. "I hope so," Pierre replied. But deep down, he wasn't sure. Life in France was changing fast. Schools were built to educate all children. Scientists and thinkers shared new ideas. One day, Pierre read about a man who had discovered a vaccine for smallpox. He showed the article to Marie. "This is amazing," he said. "The revolution isn't just about politics. It's about progress." Marie smiled. "Maybe the future will be brighter after all," she said. Amid the progress, there was still pain. Many families had lost loved ones during the Reign of Terror. Pierre often thought of his friend Jacques, the baker. One afternoon, Pierre visited Jacques' family. They were struggling to run the bakery without him. Pierre helped them carry sacks of flour and sweep the floor. Jacques believed in the revolution. Pierre said softly, "We must keep believing, too." As the years passed, the revolution's leaders changed. Some rose to power, others fell. The dream of liberty, equality, and fraternity was alive, but it was fragile. One day, Pierre attended a meeting in the assembly. He listened to the debates. Some argued for more change. Others wanted stability. Pierre noticed a young soldier in the corner. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was quiet but observant. Pierre felt a strange sense of curiosity about him. The revolution had transformed France. Feudal rights were gone. The monarchy was over. The people had a voice. But the journey was not finished. Pierre knew that building a new nation would take time and courage. He walked home, that evening, his mind full of thoughts. He passed a group of children playing in the street. They laughed and sang. Pierre smiled. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope. Chapter 9. Robespierre falls. Robespierre stood at the height of his power. He had led the revolution through storms of anger and fear. He had fought for liberty and justice. But now, the people whispered his name with fear. Pierre heard these whispers as he walked through the crowded streets of Paris. Robespierre is dangerous, some said. He sees enemies everywhere. The guillotine had become a tool of terror. Nobles, priests, and even ordinary citizens had been sent to their deaths. Anyone who questioned Robespierre's ideas was accused of betraying the revolution. Marie looked worried as she spoke to Pierre. "Do you think he will stop?" she asked. Pierre shook his head. "I don't think he knows how to stop," he said softly. In the National Assembly, Robespierre gave speeches full of fire. His voice was strong and his words were sharp. "We must protect the revolution," he said. "Our enemies are everywhere." At first, the assembly listened. Many believed Robespierre was right. But over time, his words began to sound like threats. One day, he accused members of the assembly of working against the revolution. He refused to name them. The members grew uneasy. "How can we trust him if he accuses us all?" one whispered to Pierre. The people of Paris began to turn against Robespierre. The streets were filled with anger. Many had lost family and friends to the guillotine. They wanted the terror to end. In cafes and markets, people debated. Some still supported Robespierre. They believed he was protecting the revolution. Others called him a tyrant. Pierre listened to these debates. He remembered how Robespierre had inspired hope in the early days, but now hope had turned to fear. On July 26, 1794, Robespierre gave a long speech to the assembly. He spoke of conspiracies and traitors. His words were powerful, but his tone was harsh. Some members of the assembly grew angry. "This is too much," one muttered. "He sees enemies in every shadow." The next day, the assembly acted. Robespierre and his allies were arrested. Pierre heard the news in the square. "Robespierre," he said aloud. He couldn't believe it. Robespierre was taken to the same prison where so many others had waited for their fate. For the first time, he was powerless. His supporters tried to rescue him, but their efforts failed. The people had turned against him. Marie read the news in the paper. "He is going to face the guillotine," she said. Pierre nodded slowly. He created the terror. Now it will end with him. The morning of July 28, 1794, was bright and clear. Crowds gathered in the square to watch Robespierre's execution. Pierre stood among them. He felt a mix of emotions. Robespierre had once been a hero, but now he was seen as a monster. Robespierre climbed the steps to the scaffold. His face was pale. The crowd was silent as the blade fell. The reign of terror ended with Robespierre's death. The streets of Paris felt calmer. The guillotine was used less and less. Marie looked out of the window one evening. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Pierre joined her. "The terror is over," he said. "But the revolution isn't finished." France began to change once again. The National Assembly worked to rebuild trust. New leaders stepped forward, promising stability. But the wounds of the terror were deep. Many families had lost loved ones. The people were tired. They wanted peace. Pierre walked through the market one afternoon. He saw children playing and people laughing. It felt like a new beginning. He thought of Robespierre's dream of liberty and equality. "We still believe in those dreams," he said to himself, "but we've learned how dangerous fear can be." Marie joined him, carrying a basket of bread. "Look," she said with a smile. "The market is full again. Maybe things are getting better." Pierre smiled. He hoped she was right. Robespierre's fall marked the end of one chapter in the revolution. But it was not the end of the story. France was still searching for its future. The people wanted a government that could bring peace and prosperity. One name was whispered in the streets: Napoleon Bonaparte. Pierre heard the whispers. He wondered what the future would bring. Chapter 10. The Rise of Napoleon. France was exhausted. The revolution had brought many changes, but it had also brought chaos. The streets of Paris were calmer now, but the people were still uneasy. They longed for stability. Pierre sat in a cafe, listening to a group of men talk. "We need a leader," one said. "Someone who can bring order." Another nodded. "Have you heard of Napoleon Bonaparte?" he asked. "They say he's brilliant, a real military genius." Pierre frowned. He had heard the name before. Napoleon was a young general who had won battles in Italy. People admired him. But Pierre wondered, can one man really save France? Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the island of Corsica. He came from a poor but proud family. As a boy, he dreamed of being a soldier. He studied hard at military school. His teachers saw his talent. He was clever, focused, and determined. "This boy will go far," one said. When the revolution began, Napoleon saw an opportunity. He joined the army and quickly rose through the ranks. His victories made him famous. By 1799, France was in trouble again. The government, known as the Directory, was weak. Corruption was everywhere. The people were losing hope. Napoleon saw his chance. He returned to Paris and planned his next move. One cold November day, Napoleon took action. With the support of his soldiers, he overthrew the government. The Directory was gone. Napoleon declared himself the first consul of France. The people were shocked, but many felt relief. They wanted someone strong to lead them. Pierre stood in the crowd as Napoleon gave his first speech. His voice was steady and confident. "I will bring order to France," Napoleon said. "I will protect our revolution and make our nation great." The crowd cheered. Pierre felt a spark of hope. Maybe he really can bring stability, he thought. Napoleon worked quickly. He created new laws to bring fairness. He established schools so more children could learn. He signed a peace treaty with France's enemies. Marie read the news with a smile. "Look, Pierre," she said. "Things are getting better. Bread prices are lower. The streets are safe again." Pierre nodded. He couldn't deny it. Napoleon was making progress. But Napoleon wanted more than stability. He wanted glory. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France. It was a grand ceremony in Notre Dame Cathedral. The Pope was there, but Napoleon placed the crown on his own head. Marie watched the event on a sketch in the newspaper. "Emperor?" she said, her voice uneasy. "Is this what we wanted?" Pierre didn't answer. He felt uneasy too. As emperor, Napoleon led France into war. His armies marched across Europe, winning battle after battle. He defeated Austria, Prussia, and even the mighty Holy Roman Empire. The people of France celebrated. They believed Napoleon was unstoppable. Pierre watched the parades in the streets. Soldiers carried flags and sang songs. Children waved at the troops. But Pierre couldn't ignore the cost. "So many young men are dying," he said to Marie one evening. "How much more can France give?" Napoleon's power grew, but so did his enemies. Britain, Russia, and other nations formed alliances against him. In 1812, Napoleon made a bold decision. He invaded Russia with a massive army. At first, he seemed unstoppable, but the harsh winter and lack of food destroyed his troops. Pierre read the reports with dread. "This is a disaster," he said. "Why did he take such a risk?" Marie shook her head. "Ambition," she said. Napoleon returned to France after the failure in Russia. His enemies saw their chance. In 1814, they invaded Paris. Napoleon was forced to give up his throne. The people of France were shocked. Some still loved him. Others were relieved. Napoleon was sent into exile on the island of Elba. Pierre stood in the square as the news spread. He felt a mix of emotions. Napoleon had brought stability and pride to France, but his ambition had also brought suffering. The story didn't end there. In 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France. Crowds cheered as he marched to Paris. He promised to restore France's glory, but his return was short-lived. Just 100 days later, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. This time, there was no escape. Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena. He would never return. Pierre sat with Marie, thinking about the past. Napoleon was a genius, he said. He gave us hope when we needed it most. Marie nodded. But he also showed us the danger of too much power. Pierre agreed. Napoleon's rise and fall had changed France forever. France was ready to move forward. The revolution had ended the monarchy and brought new ideas. Napoleon had brought stability and pride. But the future was still uncertain. Pierre looked out at the streets of Paris. The city was alive with energy. Children laughed, and people debated in cafes. The people of France are strong, he said. We will find our way. Chapter 11. A New France. The streets of Paris were quiet. The wars were over, and Napoleon was gone. France had been through so much. The monarchy, the revolution, the reign of terror, and Napoleon's empire had all left their mark. Now, the people wanted peace. Pierre sat at a small cafe, watching the city move on. He sipped his coffee slowly. What have we gained? He wondered aloud. And what have we lost? Marie joined him with a basket of bread. We gained freedom, she said. We lost kings who thought they were gods. Isn't that enough? Pierre nodded. Yes, but at what cost? Under Napoleon, France had become powerful. His armies had marched across Europe, spreading the ideas of the revolution. They had ended feudal systems and brought new laws. The Napoleonic Code was one of Napoleon's greatest achievements. It was a set of laws that treated all men equally. It gave people the right to own property. It also protected businesses. Marie read about the code in the newspaper. This is what we dreamed of during the revolution, she said. Laws for everyone, not just for nobles. Pierre agreed. The Napoleonic Code inspired governments around the world. It was a legacy of the revolution. But Napoleon's ambition had also brought destruction. His wars had killed millions. Families across Europe mourned their sons, fathers, and brothers. One day, Pierre walked past a group of soldiers. They were missing limbs and wore old uniforms. They sat on the steps, begging for coins. He gave them what he could. These men fought for France, he thought. But what did they gain? The revolution's ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity had spread beyond France. In America, people admired the French Revolution. They saw it as a fight for justice. In other parts of Europe, people began to question their own kings and queens. Could they have freedom too? Could they have equality? Marie spoke with a neighbor one afternoon. The revolution changed the world, she said. It showed that ordinary people have power. The neighbor nodded. But it also showed how dangerous power can be, he replied. France itself was trying to rebuild. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, the monarchy returned. But it was not the same as before. Kings no longer had absolute power. Pierre read about the new king, Louis XVIII, in the paper. He's careful, Pierre said to Marie. He knows the people won't accept another tyrant. Marie sighed. But will they ever trust a king again? The streets of Paris began to heal. Markets were busy again. Children played in the squares. But there was still tension in the air. Many people wanted to forget the past. Others wanted to keep fighting for the revolution's ideals. Pierre met with friends at a cafe one evening. They debated what the revolution had achieved. We have equality under the law, one man said. That's a victory. But only for men, a woman replied. Women are still treated as less important. The group fell silent. Pierre thought about Marie. She was strong and smart. She had been part of the revolution, too. The revolution had promised freedom. But for many, freedom still felt out of reach. Workers struggled with low wages. Farmers worried about their crops. Marie walked through the market one morning. She saw a boy selling flowers. He looked tired and thin. She bought a small bouquet and gave him a coin. Are you okay? She asked gently. The boy nodded, but his eyes were sad. My father died in the war, he said. Marie's heart ached. She thought of all the families who had suffered. Despite the struggles, France was changing. New schools opened their doors. People learned to read and write. Scientists and inventors created new machines. Pierre visited a workshop one afternoon. He watched a man demonstrate a steam engine. This will change everything, the man said proudly. We can build trains, factories, and new cities. Pierre smiled. The future looks bright, he said. France's new government was different from the old monarchy. It was based on the ideas of the revolution. People had a voice in how they were governed. But Pierre noticed that power still rested in the hands of a few. We have more work to do, he thought. Marie agreed. The revolution was only the beginning, she said. As the years passed, France became a symbol of change. Other countries looked to it for inspiration. Pierre walked through the streets of Paris one evening. The city was alive with energy. People gathered in cafes to share ideas. Artists painted in the squares. Musicians played in the parks. He felt proud of his country. We have come so far, he thought, but we must keep going. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Revolution. The French Revolution changed the world. It was a story of courage, hope, and pain. Ordinary people stood up against kings and nobles. They fought for liberty and equality. Pierre walked through the streets of Paris, reflecting on the past. The city had changed. The grand palace of Versailles no longer held the king. The guillotine no longer stood in the square. But the memories remained. In the beginning, the revolution was a dream. People wanted to create a better France. They wanted freedom for everyone. Pierre remembered the storming of the Bastille. He had marched with the crowd, shouting for change. The energy of that day was unforgettable. We believed anything was possible, he thought. Marie joined him as they passed a market. She pointed to a sign on the wall. It read, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." "We still believe in these words," she said. Pierre nodded. "But we've learned how hard they are to achieve," he replied. The revolution showed the world that kings were not untouchable. In France, the monarchy fell. Across Europe, people began to question their rulers. In America, leaders looked to the French Revolution for inspiration. The ideas of democracy spread. But these ideas came at a high price. Pierre thought about the reign of terror. So many lives were lost in the name of liberty. Did it have to be this way? He wondered. Marie spoke softly as they walked. "The revolution gave us hope," she said. "But it also brought fear." Pierre agreed. He remembered how people had turned against each other. Neighbors became enemies. Friends were sent to the guillotine. "Fear is a powerful weapon," he said. "But it's also dangerous." The Napoleonic Code was one of the revolution's lasting legacies. It brought laws that treated all men equally. It inspired governments around the world. Marie read about a country adopting similar laws. "The revolution's ideas are still alive," she said. Pierre smiled. "We may not have achieved everything we wanted," he said, "but we started something important." The revolution also brought change to everyday life. Feudal rights were gone. Peasants no longer worked for free. Schools were built so more children could learn. Pierre visited a village where a new school had opened. The children laughed and played in the yard. Their teacher greeted Pierre warmly. "These children will grow up in a new France," the teacher said. Pierre felt a spark of hope. The future is in their hands, he thought. But the revolution's legacy was complicated. Not everyone felt free. Women still fought for equality. Workers struggled to make ends meet. Marie spoke with a group of women one afternoon. They were organizing for better rights. "We fought for liberty too," one woman said, "but our voices are still not heard." Marie admired their courage. She joined their efforts, determined to make a difference. Pierre walked through a park one evening. He saw a young artist painting a scene of Paris. The artist's hands moved quickly, capturing the beauty of the city. "What inspires you?" Pierre asked. "The revolution," the artist replied. "It showed us the power of ideas. It gave us the freedom to create." Pierre smiled. Art, music, and literature had flourished since the revolution. The people of France were expressing themselves in new ways. As the sun set, Pierre and Marie climbed a hill overlooking Paris. The city lights sparkled below. The revolution changed us, Pierre said. It taught us to fight for what we believe in. Marie nodded. It also taught us the value of peace, she said. They stood in silence for a moment, thinking about everything France had been through. The French Revolution left a lasting legacy. It inspired hope, but also brought pain. It showed the world the power of ordinary people, but it also showed the dangers of fear and ambition. Pierre thought about the question often asked, "Would you have joined the fight?" He looked at Marie. She had been brave and determined during the revolution. "Yes," he said softly. "I would have joined because some things are worth fighting for." Marie smiled. "So would I," she replied. The story of the French Revolution is one of transformation. It turned dreams into action. It changed France and the world forever. As Pierre and Marie walked home, they felt a sense of pride. The revolution's journey had been hard, but its lessons